Well everyone, it's time for us to go ahead and take a look at the Samsung Galaxy S9 Plus and see how this specific phone holds up in 2023. Now I will definitely tell you this is a very interesting phone. I think the hardware is still holding up, I think it still holds up in the, feeling of the phone and the premiumness of this device, but I just don't think this is the first phone you should probably consider buying this year, but we'll go ahead and talk about all that all throughout this video. Now this was a 2018 flagship phone. This was probably one of the more expensive phones Samsung dropped in 2018. We also had the Galaxy Notes of that year as well, but this was pretty much, when you think of almost like the Ultras and maybe even like the Z Fold and all those, this was the most expensive phone that Samsung dropped that year, which is honestly pretty cool. Now, I will tell you, maybe this phone's not worth it, but I'll leave some other phones linked in the description. You can get them from there. You can help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the outside, this phone on the front had a 6.2-inch Super AMOLED display. It was a 1440p panel, and it was still a very, very good display. Samsung dropped this phone the same exact time they dropped the Galaxy S9, so it was pretty much this, just a bigger version. It was the Plus model of the S9, and I feel like the Plus lineup is kind of forgotten about. Even at this time, I feel like a lot of people kind of forgot about the Plus phones. They kind of more so focus on the smaller ones, or maybe even the Note ones. And even especially now, the Plus lineup is almost going to be gone, apparently with the next generation of devices. But I like the Plus lineup, and I thought they brought a lot to the table, and having a bigger display in this case was really cool. Funny enough, for some reason, the newer phones' displays seem way, way smaller, even though they're almost the same size as this one. So it's very interesting how things change like that. You had a little bit of bezel on the top, a little bit of bezel at the bottom, but you had this curved display which still looks and feels so good. It's not a 120Hz panel, it's only 60Hz or whatever, but it's still a very good panel. I think it's honestly one of its strong suits for sure. And with this phone being almost 5 years old, it's honestly quite shocking how good this phone still looks so many years later. Now on the bottom, you had a USB-C port, which had Samsung text on it, which was really cool. You had a headphone jack as well, and you had a microSD card slot on the side of this phone, which was amazing, or at the top or the bottom. That was an amazing thing to have on this specific device. Being able to quickly expand your storage is really cool. Unfortunately, that's been pretty much gone on every single phone nowadays, but it's still super nice that we had it at one point on these devices, which in my opinion is pretty much, that's a really cool feature to have. It was pretty much 2 more generations after this that we pretty much got the microSD card slot removed, so in a way this may have been one of the last devices to pick up, an SD card in if you think about it, but regardless, I really, really missed that feature. Now on the back, we had the standard glass back, which was nice. We had a fingerprint sensor under the dual camera setup, which was a very interesting touch. And overall, that was kind of it. You had wireless charging on this phone, you had IP certification, and overall this phone, it wasn't like a bad feeling phone. It felt very, very premium. It still looks like a pretty decent phone. If you were to, kind of the way I think about it, if you were to go and recycle this phone and just kind of give it some newer internals, I think a lot of people would still be okay with this phone. I think a lot of people would definitely be more than okay with a phone like this if it had maybe like a Qualcomm Snapdragon 888 chipset. So in my opinion, still a very solid phone on the outside. In the camera department, this device had a dual camera setup on the back, like I mentioned, a 12 megapixel wide-angle lens, and then a 12 megapixel telephoto lens. It kind of also had a dual camera setup on the front, but not really. It was an 8 megapixel wide-angle lens, and then a 2 megapixel iris scanner camera. Now, you could do 4K 60 on the back, 1440p on the front, and back then I think that was more than enough. It wasn't until 2019 where all phones started shooting 4K 60 on the front and the back, so this was one generation right before that. But this camera, I think, is still okay. It's still a pretty good camera. I remember back in 2018, this was probably one of the better cameras of that year, but shortly after this we did get the iPhone XS and 10R, and I think that kind of also helped the Galaxy S9 Plus a little bit too, because they were kind of the same thing. Really the only thing this camera is missing nowadays is 4K 60 on the front and maybe an ultra-wide camera. I really like ultra-wide cameras a lot, and in this case we didn't really have that capability, but it is kind of expected. You're not going to have every single little thing on every single phone out there, but I think this camera is honestly still pretty decent. And I've talked about this before, but there were many videos that I used to watch of some people in concerts, believe it or not, some random stuff. There was this one person who would almost always film concerts, and I was like, this camera is pretty good. It's not like a DSLR, but you could tell it's a phone, but it was a really good quality phone. And it turns out they were using a Galaxy S9 Plus, which was was very interesting. I don't know why I always remember that. That's so random, but that's kind of how this camera holds up, I guess. Now, moving on to probably one of the sadder aspects of this phone, it is kind of outdated with software. And when I say kind of, I mean it's been outdated with software for like the last few years now. It started off with Android 8.0, pretty much the update right before One UI, and then it eventually got One UI 2.5. Now, One UI 2.5 was actually a pretty big update. I thought it brought a lot to the table. But the thing nowadays is that this phone, even with One UI 2.5, it's, we're already on One UI 5 at this point. So we're like 2 generations or 3 generations above this phone. We had One UI 3, One UI 4, One UI 5. We're about to get the Android 14 betas, and then One UI 4 is going to come out later this year. So this phone in that standpoint is severely outdated, just in terms of, the feature set and everything, not even touching the security standpoint. I mean, this phone is, very outdated in the security side as well. So because of that, it doesn't really make too much sense to go ahead and buy a phone like this because you're already going to have an outdated device. And I hate recommending phones to people where they're pretty much already going to be outdated. And this is pretty much that device. You are going to be getting a outdated device if you go ahead and buy a phone like this. So what do? Do you just not buy this phone? Well, yeah, I would probably recommend not buying this phone because of that, because you don't want to buy a phone that's already outdated. You want to buy a phone that's still supported with software, since you can kind of have things to look forward to and it's a more secure device. If you currently own this phone, then I think that's a different story, but if you don't own it, I probably wouldn't recommend buying it because of the software standpoint. So in terms of that, that's kind of how I feel about it in that standpoint. Now on the performance side, this device did have that Qualcomm Snapdragon 845 chipset inside of it with 4 gigs of RAM on the base model, but it did go up to 6 gigabytes of RAM. Now I've owned a couple of Galaxy S9 Pluses, and the ones that I use or normally own, those ones do have 4 gigabytes of RAM, so they are not the top tier models. But I remember back, in 2018 and 2019, I believe the first time I got my hands on an S9 Plus was in 2019, and I liked that phone. I liked it. I thought it was fairly fast at that moment. I do remember installing One UI 2.5 on my S9 Plus at that moment as well, and it was still a very fast phone. It still felt very premium. It still felt like it could do everything I threw at it, and having that kind of bigger display kind of felt really good to me. I do like having bigger phones, and maybe I will switch back to a bigger phone at some point. But with this phone, doing light, intensive things is going to be fine. I've actually played Genshin Impact and many other games like that on this type of device, and it's kind of surprising how good of a job these phones do on kind of the mid-tier graphics settings. If you go to the highest graphics settings, these phones tend to have, they tend to heat up a little bit, which is expected. But I think at this point, the performance of this phone is honestly a little bit better than you'd think. It's definitely not going to be the first phone I'd recommend buying anymore, but it is a little, it's a cool phone when you consider how old this phone is. So, in terms of performance, it wouldn't be the first phone I'd recommend buying, but it still actually does perform decently well when you kind of think about it. So, ending it off with the battery life, this thing had a 3500 mAh battery inside of it, which was not that bad of a size battery back then. But funny enough, nowadays, I feel like our phones have way bigger size batteries and a way smaller frame. So that's another thing to kind of keep in mind as well. When you're getting a phone like this, you're getting a battery size that's kind of maybe equivalent to something like a Galaxy S22 nowadays, and maybe even the S23 that hasn't came out, the base models. So that's another thing to kind of keep in mind. And to be honest, when it kind of comes down to it, I think the Galaxy S9 Plus is not really worth it anymore. I don't really think that phone is necessarily the first phone you should recommend, to buy. I think if you buy something like the Galaxy S10 Plus, that would make a little bit more sense. But I think the S9 Plus isn't really worth it, considering it's kind of outdated. Even with a phone like an S10 Plus, that is technically outdated. It's, lasted, I think, on One UI 4, so it's 2 versions ahead of the S9 Plus. So I don't think the S9 Plus is worth buying, but, there's definitely phones that are only slightly more expensive than this thing that are still worth buying, in my opinion. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.